Next up is a presentation of the King Farm Farmstead Task Force report. Welcome, Mr. Chestnut.
Good evening, Madam Mayor, members of council. Before I introduce the task force, I want to join in the thanking. Thank you all for your support for our hometown holidays. It was not the best weather, but we appreciated your being there, and particularly on Monday for the parade. It was you guys played an important role, so thank you. As I'm sure you'll remember, last August 2016, you guys appointed a King Farm task force. They were given a very challenging charge. It was to work within some constraints, from being historic designation to the deed and covenant that came with the property, to what the immediate community desired, to coming up with a wow factor. So they had a lot of constraints to work within. They've worked very hard, very diligently since September. Started off meeting once a month and quickly realized that wasn't going to be enough. I think they've come up with quite a plan for you. What they're asking for from you tonight is your comments, your input, and any direction. Yeah, I think you will be interested by some of these ideas that they've come up with. What we have is Mr. John Carter is going to be taking care of the presentation for you, and others of the members are here, so when it's time for questions or comments, they may take turns answering.
Terrific.
Any questions for staff before I get out of your way?
Oh, thanks very much. Thank you. Welcome to all of you, and thank you for your service on this very important task force.
So thank you. For the record, I'm John Carter, a member of the task force. So what we have here for you is a few slides that would lay out our recommendations for use of the King Farm Farmstead. So the King Farm Farmstead is made up of several buildings. Do you get the power? Do you get the arrow?
Yeah, we see it right here.
Okay. So there's the house. This is 355 is on the bottom. There's the house, and the main feature is the double dairy barns. Then the horse barn that's here, then there's tenant houses. And then, of course, it's about 6 acres, garden plots, and open space. So keep that in mind. So there's our vision. So the King Farm Farmstead will commemorate the history of the site as a farm while celebrating the King Farm's place as an integral part of Rockville today. And you see several images there. The main one I think to look at is the marketplace. You have if you have a marketplace, you can have events. You'll be able to commemorate the farm. The picnic pavilion is already there. You have the garage for farm equipment, culinary arts, other recreation and entertainment there. So the main part of our recommendations has to do with these 3 buildings. One is the barns, 2 would be the house, and then the horse barn. So for the barns, the marketplace. So there are several of them. You all run one in the city, and there's several in Montgomery County and Washington, D.C., and in Fairfax. And I'm going to go over a few of those. But you have a little bit different situation here with the double barn. So one of them could be used as the marketplace, and the other could be used as an event place with a catering kitchen in it. Precedents that we looked at, and we had fun going to these places, Union Market in Washington, which is a big one, the Bethesda Farm Women's Market, which is a little bit smaller than this one. Cookology Center in Dulles. This is a retail establishment where they actually bring in famous chefs from around Washington, and the people hire them to teach them how to make whatever. In this case, it would be the farm products. And then a kitchen incubator place there. So you have the full service. You can grow your farm produce there. You can learn how to cook it. You can cook it, and you can buy it there. The whole, if there was a word farm to table, this would be it. We looked at 3 different ways that these are constructed. One is private ownership, and Eden's is the retail outfit. They're from Atlanta. They own retail centers up and down the East Coast. But the main one there is Union Market, and it's open almost every day during the week. That's a very large one. The second one is the Farm Women's Market, which has been around since the Depression, 1932. I think they're getting kind of tired of running it a little bit, but that's lasted quite well. They purchased the site, they built the building, and they actually got a loan, for of all things, during the Depression, paid that loan off in 10 years. But they've been in continuous operation again since 1932. They're open 4 days a week. So you have a cooperative situation where a group of people get together, they do shares, run it that way. The more common one is the third one. And the Eastern Market is of course, a big one in Washington, which has been around since, 1873 or so. This is run by the city, Recreation Department. There are other ones in Montgomery County in the city. Fairfax is an interesting one where they have 11 of these markets. And the Recreation Department takes the money from the vendors. They set up the rules of what you can sell, and they establish a list of vendors that people can pick from. Then for each of the 11, they have volunteers run the whole thing, volunteers from the surrounding area. They use the list of vendors and bring them in. They run the farm markets. Some of them are not too successful, but some of them are extremely successful. The one in Ruston has 30 vendors. They run Saturday mornings only. They also have a craft show there, and it's quite active. So my point is, you can have ones that not too much work to run it, or you can hire it out in a more of a retail fashion. And of course, these things are filled with wonderful images that you see. The Union Market is up on the top. They rent food stalls throughout and crafts. And then the one in the middle is a little bit more the Farm Women's Market. And then some of these are throughout the country. You have these event centers. It's really a large room could use for a whole variety of things, from teaching people how to do things to recreation. But you can see barns make a wonderful resource to hold those kinds of things. In the middle is the cookology examples, and you see these are families gathered around these commercial, they're actually fancy hot plates is really what they are. And a chef comes in and teaches them how to cook various things. So that's the main part. Then to run this, you probably would take the house and make that the center of operations. Some offices perhaps in there for staff that could be full-time, or probably more likely part-time. You could have small meetings in there. You could have it sort of your first impression of the King Farm. Examples of this, maybe a little larger, is the Strathmore Mansion, where they run the whole site. They have events in there, and their offices are upstairs. The Bell Dawson House, perhaps a smaller example. They have little offices in there. The docents are in there. And then Sandy Spring Museum, if you've been there. Those are all examples of this kind of space. So you can see some very small spaces along with the somebody's got to unlock the doors, and somebody's got to bring in the vendors. That's what you would do in the house. Then the third part of this would be what was formerly the horse barn. A good example of this is the barns at Wolf Trap, where they purchased a barn in Pennsylvania, brought it down and rebuilt it on the site, perhaps a little bit bigger than this one, but you can see those barns make a very rustic sort of place, and they have concerts in there. You could have performing arts facilities of all kinds, drama stages. One of the task force members kind of canvassed a variety of small playhouses in Montgomery County. I've forgotten how many it was. It was like about 30. So 150 to 200 seats that you could do in there in a fairly rustic setting. A little more elaborate one is at the Kentlands in one of the barns there. But I think the images are terrific, I think. Then perhaps a little less important, we have a number of other structures. So what would you do with those? So we've got a shed there that house farming equipment. You've got 2 tenant houses. You've got 2 silos, and then you've got the picnic pavilion. So the tenant house, the garage, you could just stabilize it. Perhaps if it's very successful, you could put farm equipment. I don't know if you've been up to the King Farm Museum in Germantown. That's an example of that, a bigger example of that. On-site storage, you gotta have lawnmowers and all those practical things that people have to have in these. And again, the example that's a little bit bigger would be the museum. Then you've got 2 tenant houses. The larger tenant house was a small horse barn, so you could either stabilize it in the short run or maybe eventually put it into actually a farm kind of use there, or a former use. And then the small tenant house probably could be renovated. The silos, people wonder what to do with the silo because it's fairly specific in what you did with the silo. One task force member used it as an astronautical observatory. There's one in Fairfax called the Turner Farm that they've developed actually a club that meets in there fairly actively. And they go out on Saturday and look at the stars and all the things that astronomers do in those. So that's a possibility. The other one, you probably just stabilize it to keep it going. And then the picnic shelter, which looks kind of lonely out there today, but if you look at the images of these things, if it was an extension of the market, you could do wonderful things in that. Besides picnics is okay, you could sell produce, you could have events in that picnic pavilion, which is already done for you. Now we get to the site. So certainly retaining the existing open space was high on the list. We had one meeting we had representatives from the King Farm community. We had one meeting that we presented to the King Farm community. And so open space was important. Community gardens would stay. Parking for the handicapped. There's an afforestation area that was put on this site as part of the original development of the rest of King Farm. You have some, rumor has it that there's a tavern there somewhere, and we might be able to uncover those. And then interpretive signage. Now, one of the main issues is how do you get to this off of 355? There is no access to it off of 355. It's on the next lot, which was part of the original King Farm, but it's not part of this. So you got to work out an access point to get to this. And then parking. To do any major parking, you do have the park down the street. It's a little bit of a hike to get here, but you're probably going to have the possibility of a joint venture with the adjacent property to get some parking there. So the next steps, well, you've got to have funding sources. There's infrastructure improvements, not insignificant. But I think you could get started, if you could work out the access and the parking, you could get started this Saturday, I think. You could have the tents the way these markets you see them. Many of them are in parking lots, so you could line them up along the sort of alley that goes between the various structures, and you could do that right away as you're getting started into renovating the barns. Probably would start with renovating the dairy barn. The house is in not too bad a shape, so you probably could occupy that pretty soon. But this access and parking, you really need to do that to get started. And then there's some priorities to work out. How much money do you have? But I think if you started with the dairy barns, the rest you could phase it out. So what we've developed is a solid recommendation. I think that recommendation comes in many forms. You could start out in a small way, like I was saying with the tents, or you could start out in a major way, which is starting with the dairy barns, or you could go even bigger and go as far as you can go. But I think this would be pretty unique. There's nothing like it in the Washington area. Farm Women's Market, you can't grow anything there. If you go to Eastern Market, they don't have the classes or the structures that they have. A pretty nice structure there. They spent $22 million renovating that since the fire from last year. But you have a barn and a house and a variety of barns, and you've got the land there, and you're right on 355. That kind of dynamic makes this probably very plausible. So we're here to ask questions. If you've got any questions for us, I hope you liked our images, and I hope the wow factor is there for you.
Great. Mr. Carter, thank you very much for the
Yes.
presentation, and thank you to all of you for your work on this. Comments or questions, council members? Councilmember Priscilla.
Thank you, Mr. Carter, and thank you, members of the King Farm Task Force. I think you've done a wonderful job. I originally brought forward the idea of a task force, number one, because just the amount of time it would take to flesh out all the possibilities that shared across quite a few people. I appreciate the creativity, the incredible research, the travel you did around the area. I think we have some very good ideas here, and I hope we can actually bring this to realization sometime in the foreseeable future. I do have some questions. I'll defer those for now. I just wanted to express my gratitude. I will say the constraints are still there, and one being the covenants still, but perhaps we can finesse that. Parking, I agree, that's got to be one of the first things we look at. And but the third thing, and I started looking at this well before I was on the council when I took Rockville University, the predecessor Rockville Academy, and this was, must have been 2005 or something like that. And when Rockville University went around the King Farm site, and I was talking to Bert Hall, how much does it cost to renovate, just stabilize the place? And the city staff at that time, now well over a decade ago, said $17 million. And we know we'll have an item later today where we're stabilizing the barns. We're not renovating, but we're stabilizing them, and that's gone 140% over budget just because the challenge, the physical challenge has been there. So that's your next step, identifying funding sources. It's going to be a big one, but I agree that parking component is really a key thing that we have to tackle. Hopefully, somehow we can acquire that property or get use of it where the ingress and egress is from Route 355, and that way it minimizes the impact on the King Farm community, which was a big deal. I will say that there was, unfortunately, there was an opportunity several years ago with Bikes for the World, Growing Soul, and Habitat for Humanity. That did not come to fruition for a variety of reasons, which is why I then thought, well, we need to have a task force because we wanted to get community involvement in on this and not just sort of spring, here's an idea on the community. And so I think the task force has satisfied me, more than exceeded my expectations for what it could be, and has done a wonderful job. And I'm really looking forward to that staging plan and how we're going to pay for all this, because I think it's going to be something else. And by the way, the one really solid recommendation you made in this about spending $20,000 for an archaeological study, I think we should that's a no-brainer. We should just go ahead and do that quickly. And I got to say, it's probably a little known, but apparently the King Farm Farmstead is somehow there's established an informal connection to the city sewer system that was done years ago, and I'm kind of wondering if that informal connection actually goes through that site, that area number 6, where the study is going to go. Okay, all right, thank you.
All right, thank you. Other comments or thoughts? Councilmember Plakovich-Carr.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you all for your hard work and good ideas. In reading through your report, this might sound underwhelming, but I just was struck by how plausible this all seems. That really is meant as the highest compliment that you came up with something where it honors the history of the site, and it actually seems like something that the city could do and people would use it, and it would be an asset in the community. So thank you for that. I did have one question. I know that you've made presentations or reached out to a number of different groups at this point, and I saw in your report that the Rec and Parks Advisory Board weighed in positively with some reservations regarding parking and management of operations. I'm wondering, have any other entities, say the King Farm Citizens Assembly or any other groups, weighed in officially with comments on the report to date?
Yeah, I'll take that. Yes, the King Farm Citizens Assembly has been briefed because I ended up here by happenstance at all of their board meetings on the progress of the task force. But we also held a meeting on May 18th for the community, which we advertised and advertised and advertised. And we had about 30 people at that meeting, which, for something like that is a fairly good number. And there were some concerns. Parking was a concern on the streets, traffic through the streets, and not taking away the community garden. So those were the major constraints. There were questions about budgeting, which of course we couldn't answer because we don't have a budget yet. There were questions about the feasibility of what we were proposing, which will come out when we start planning the next phase. But all in all, the community and the people who were at the meeting were excited about something new and different, and we're looking forward to having something on the site. So I think the response was positive, and the Assembly is supporting what the task force comes up with. So from that perspective, yeah, it's a good thing, and I'd love to see the tavern rebuilt. I keep telling these guys, do the archaeological site, because I think that would be a phenomenal community hanging out place. So yeah, the community's engaged, and every once in a while something will pop up on our Facebook page or on listserv, what's going on with the Farmstead. And I think, for those of you who are at our 20th anniversary celebration Saturday night, I mentioned that we were doing this presentation tonight, if anybody was interested to watch Channel 11. Our Last Chronicle, which is our newspaper, has an article which actually has the entire presentation and all of the feedback in it, and that came out last week. So the whole community has that information as well.
Terrific, thank you. Other comments or questions? Councilmember Feinberg.
Thank you very much. I'll echo what my colleagues said. First of all, thank you to each of you for sharing your expertise and giving up of your time and time that you might have spent with families or doing other activities. So thank you each for your participation. A couple of process things as I read this, and other task force reports that I've read over years, some different venues. Is this report represent a unanimous viewpoint of everyone on the task force, or were there any other minority report? It's just something as a question.
It was unanimously adopted. Yeah, we did put the recommendations to a vote, and the language of the report was submitted to all members of the task force, and they were invited to submit any change in language, and we received none. So my interpretation would be that the report as well as the recommendations are all unanimously approved.
Thank you. I just wanted to understand that because there are other kinds of task forces that will have a report and then a minority report. So thank you very much for establishing
we
that.
did make provision for minority report if anyone cared to express concerns or reservations, and no one did.
Thank you. So several years ago, as many of us up here, and I'm sure you're all aware, there was that facility assessment which was done, which had a prioritization, 3 different tiers, those which were urgent, those which were not as urgent, and it was quite detailed. It was probably, at this point, I would guess the dollar amounts that were in there probably are 3 years old at least. because when they had performed the assessment. So one of my concerns and questions, as I know it says establish funding sources, we have a bench line from, albeit 3 years ago, what some of these costs might be. And so one of the things to me is before we would go forward, it's not just establishing a funding source, but some ballpark estimate for each of these recommendations. One of the things that struck me is it spoke about public access, whether it was for the marketplace or for holding private events, or the administrative offices on the second level, I believe it said, or a Rockville museum, is ADA compliance once you make this a public property. And I didn't see that mentioned anywhere about accessibility once you make it a public venue. I know it's historic and there are exemptions, but it's something I think we need to look at when we're really beginning, not that we take a bite and all of a sudden the costs are just exponentially greater. So that was one thing. And then of course in the report you do have the acknowledgement, and has been mentioned here, the concern over parking, number one, and management of it, whether it's been mentioned here, either volunteer management, would it be staff management? That would certainly mean more staff. That's a fiscal impact. The grounds. This speaks to the capital investment most of the time, but not the ongoing maintenance for these sites, even once the initial investment is undertaken. So I guess what I would like to see is a wholesale look with these recommendations, flushing them out to some kind of capital one-time expenditures as well as ongoing maintenance, and the impact that potentially for the city's budget, because it's all about choices. So I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Chestnut?
I was just going to say to Councilwoman Feinberg that those questions are absolutely some that need to be answered, but that's beyond the scope of what the task force was charged with at this point.
I understand. I just don't want us to be in a position of giving direction tonight. I think there are so many questions, as you're acknowledging, before we can give direction, is I guess where I'm coming from.
Councilmember Prashela.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, and I just want to remark that what Councilmember Feinberg said is absolutely true. But I do also want to just remind people that the Farmstead came into Rockville as part of a deal for the King Farm community, and there's an obligation there by this community, by Rockville as a community as a whole, to preserve those buildings because they're historic. And one of the things that happened along the way when this was first brought up in 2009, 2010, is that Chris Henry from Recreation Parks put together a big binder of all the information that was known about King Farm Farmstead, and I know your task force had copies of that. But just that putting together in one place, and what was really astounding was the covenants. We hadn't really considered the constraints the covenants put upon the whole thing. And that really does constrain exactly what can be done at that site. And I congratulate the task force for working within those constraints. And I know there's a memo from Barbara Sears, and you know, we have to be very careful about how we approach those covenants with your ideas. Hopefully that can be worked out. But we have an obligation as a city to restore the site and to at least stabilize it. But really, in order to maintain it for hundreds of years in the future, you have to use it. You have to put people in there. You have to have ongoing maintenance. You have to identify. It's going to be far more than just 3 or 4 more positions in the Rec and Parks Department. It's going to be over the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. How do you maintain those buildings? How do you keep them viable? We were lucky the barns didn't collapse in the last big snowstorm. Had that been wet snow, had there not been wind, a soft wind to keep blowing the snow off the roofs, we could have lost those barns. So your report's very timely. But we don't have a choice. We have to move forward somehow, and that's why the next step is so important. identifying funding sources.
Mr. Carter, did you want to jump in there?
I thought one part of our recommendations, while we weren't aware of the specific costs of things, part of the beauty of the recommendation is it can be done in phased over a minute. You can start very small by just occupying the alley. Of course, you got to get the parking and access again. And then you can build as you move along the barns or the house or the other structures. So there's a way to phase this, and we were mindful of the upfront costs that this could be, and that's why we came up with this notion of phasing of the project. So hopefully we begin to address it, and there's some hope that we can do the things that we're all talking about over time.
Good, thank you. Rob, Mr. DeSpirito, did you want to?
Yes, excuse me. Yeah, just I want to say that I think that staff recognizes the importance of the comment that Councilmember Feinberg mentioned about the need for all of you and all of us as staff to have eventually, maybe sooner than later, some better idea of cost as it relates to different options. We've been discussing this internally. I think I would agree that it's not something I would charge the task force with. I think, matter of fact, I'm not even sure all of it can be generated by staff. I think that some of these cost items, some of these options would require use of an expert, building, construction, various different types of consultants, I think, or a consultant that could help us assemble that type of information. Some of it, again, is beyond what we do day to day, but that ultimately, yes, it is going to be important to have that information for you to consider relative importance of different options and how feasible they are, how they relate, and even if a phased approach is ultimately considered, I think you're going to need to know. It will help inform your thinking process about what the phases should look like by having some sense of the feasibility of cost, feasibility of resources available to you. So we'll be working, Tim and I were talking about it, we'll be working on a little bit more of a plan for you as to how we can achieve that. And we'll get that information back to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Onley.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank the task force. Your suggestions and recommendations are very good. And I was just going to say that it's imperative that we move forward for the historic preservation. We just have to figure out, okay, what direction are we going to go in first, and how small or how big are we going to move. And this is going to take probably, longer than we're going to be at this dais, but as long as we get a good start on it and start to do the preservation, I think that's basically the direction we need to go in. I don't have a suggestion at this point, but I'm open to everything.
Thank you. Councilmember Pershela, and then I was going to ask members of the task force if anybody else had anything.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I do know we had a member of the West End come forward several months ago asking about security at the Farmstead, and staff put together some figures. Yeah, can you remind us where that ended up? We're talking about security cameras, perhaps fire suppression, and the whole idea is not accidentally lose these like we lost Chestnut Lodge, while we're trying to figure out what to do with things.
Mr. Chestnut?
Yes, we got some very scary figures. So where it is at this point is we're trying to reconfigure or figure out maybe a less comprehensive but still effective way to cover because of the lack of electricity, because of the lack of water. The initial costs were kind of scary. But we do have those figures, and we're continuing to look at what would be a viable approach to secure those buildings.
Right. And Tim, I believe we got quotes for every single building there. Mm-hmm. It might be an approach where we have to make some, given resources, make some choices. Which buildings are we most concerned about? And with respect to alarms or fire suppression, that sort of thing. But we did obtain information for the big numbers, were because it covered everything.
Councilmember Prashela.
According to the Department of Interior, and we found this out during the Chestnut Lodge discussion, Farmstead consists of a farmhouse and barns. And anything else beyond that is sort of icing on the cake. But that's really got to be the priority then. You know, those are the buildings that have to be prioritized, in my opinion.
Yes, and ironically, shortly after we had the initial discussion on this, we had a minor episode at the farmhouse where someone decided it'd be a good place to have a little party that evening. So your comments were very timely.
Great, thank you. Would anyone on the task force like an opportunity to say anything?
I just wanted to add one comment. You were talking about the funding.
Can you?
Susan Prince.
Thank you.
On the task force. And we had talked to some extent about public-private financing. And I know that was mentioned in the proposal, but that was something that we thought was a very viable, and there's a lot of opportunity there, and that would be something we would really strongly encourage the city to explore, and maybe not try to take this on solely as a city effort, but also to explore opportunities for public-private funding. That's it.
Terrific, thank you. Anyone else?
Steve Andrewski. We, as Tim said, our charter was not to find funding or really look at feasibility, but some things we did explore. And I wanted to comment a little bit on the horse barn theater idea. Because of the probable large dollar amount of that and the considerable resources that would have to be put in there, we did a little bit of research on feasibility just to say, is there a need out there? And as John mentioned, we surveyed about 30 local community theater groups in the area. My wife happens to be on the board of Rockville Little Theater, and she works for the Arts Barn in Gaithersburg. So she has a lot of contacts. About 11 groups responded, and all of them were in support of an idea like that. There is a need for a small, medium-sized theater, and just from those 11 responses, you could probably program 2/3 of the year just from those responses without exploring any of the dance companies and maybe corporate events and things like that. So I think that there is feasibility in sustaining that kind of operation, which would be the largest expense in the as far as the maintenance and management of the facility.
Great, thank you. Others?
My name is Steve Carr. We do recognize coming up on your agenda this evening is your action on appropriation for expending funds for the barns, stabilization of the barns. And we also recognize that after that item on the agenda is your action on the execution of the agreement with a contractor to implement that stabilization project. We want to strongly urge the council, and I think this is the consensus of all of us, that these buildings really need stabilization. Security issues aside, there's not going to be much left to enjoy if we wait another 20 years. But we want to be careful about how that money is being spent. And as you consider the next couple of items on your agenda, that it appears as if some of the money, it's going beyond stabilization, that there's already an end use envisioned with this contract for $2.8 million or something like that. That goes beyond the mere stabilization, and that the money's not spent double dipping, so to speak, that you'll spend $500,000 on certain features of that improvement project, only to find out in another year that it needs to be removed because of a proposed use for the facility. So I think you need to weigh that carefully, and that we're all in agreement.
Great, thank you. Thank you.
I'm Bill Johnston on the task force, and I'm one of the King Farm resident members of the task force who've lived there for 17 years. And I want to thank you. I mean, you've been thanking us for our efforts, but I've been there long enough to remember the 2001, 2002 task force, the solicitation that produced the responses from Habitat and Growing Soul, the Montessori proposal, and so on. That it's under this council and mayor, it's the first time that I've really seen any significant attention to finally doing something with this potentially wonderful resource that we have in our community. So thanks very much for your efforts, and just keep it up and see it to fruition, please.
Thank you.
I guess because I haven't said anything yet, I will weigh in. We did not go, and none of these suggestions did go before the Historic District Commission yet. I know they've reviewed the work to be done to the dairy barn, so they are aware of that. But I don't believe that there's anything in the proposals that we put forward that would be particularly objectionable at this time. And of course, it will go, continue to go before them. There was the concern raised about ADA changes. I think obviously there will be some needs there, but we did discuss them a little here and there. They could be incorporated into the design. And the thought was possibly at the house, making the lower level ADA accessible and publicly accessible, but perhaps not the upper floor. That could be used in some other manner that wasn't open to the public. So that was one thought there. But I think from a preservation point of view, we really strove to come up with something that would be an asset to the community, but respect the history of the farm. And we feel that the site improvements, telling the story, can happen very successfully with the recommendations that have been put forward. And I'm Nancy Picard on the task force. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other comments or questions for the task force? Councilmember Plakovich-Carr.
Actually, if Mr. Chestnut could just respond to the comment that Mr. Carr made about the work that we're doing, the scope of the work for the stabilization. It was my recollection that we had to make some decisions that would affect the use down the line, but they had to be made now so that the stabilization could actually happen.
Yes, basically, very basically. What we were looking at was whether we wanted to build have the structural integrity adequate so that we could have for assembly use on the ground floor. One of the things, and actually Councilman Pershela piqued my memory, and we had to go back and double check it this morning. You guys were consistent in saying, yes, we see whatever the future use would be involving assembly on the ground floor, but not for the upper level. Because right now there's a plywood floor ceiling. So yes, the decisions that we went through and the process that we went through included trying to not eliminate any possible future uses, but yet still stabilizing. Does that answer?
It does. And I'll just add, my other recollection was I think the different scenarios had some pretty different costs associated with them, even though the one that we selected has gone up a lot over time. But I recall the option for having a viable second floor was really a tier above.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else? All right, well, thank you all very much. This is a lot for us to noodle over. I'm sure you'll see this on a future agenda item, and maybe even one of our work sessions that we plan to start having work sessions in the fall in place of one of our regular meetings, so that we can actually dig down into topics and really vet them thoroughly in the course of a meeting. So I look forward to working with you all going forward.